Good afternoon. Welcome to the ICAS Proceedings Winter Symposium Looks 2026. We have, again, another great speaker will be educating us, so to speak, because Jim is one of the most leading authorities on the U.S. foreign policy issues. With that understanding, PJ, you go ahead. One
Thank
of
you,
our
Dr.
interns is going to introduce you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hee-jae Jung, an ICAS intern. It is a great honor to introduce Dr. James Lindsay. Dr. Lindsay is the Mary and David Boyle's Distinguished Senior Fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. From 2009 to 2024, he was Senior Vice President, Director of Studies, and Maurice R. Greenberg Chair at CFR, where Dr. Lindsay oversaw the Council's in-house think tank, the David Rockefeller Studies Program. His scholarly work examines U.S. national security policy, the U.S. foreign policy-making process, and the domestic politics of U.S. foreign policy. Dr. Lindsay has written and edited more than a dozen books on American politics and foreign policy. His book with Evil Dowler, America Unbound, The Bush Revolution in Foreign Policy, was awarded the 2003 Lionel Galbraith Prize. Dr. Lindsay was a senior fellow in Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution from 1999 to 2003 and taught at the University of Iowa and the University of Texas. In 1996 to 97, he served as Director for Global Issues and Multilateral Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council at the White House. Dr. Lindsay hosts the weekly podcast, The President's Inbox. Dr. Lindsay is a leading authority on U.S. foreign policy. He holds an A.B. in Economics and Political Science from the University of Michigan, an M.A., M.Phil, and Ph.D. from Yale University. I would like to thank Dr. Kim for giving me the opportunity to introduce Dr. James Lindsay. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lindsay to the ICAS community.
With that, in fact, Hee-jae Jung is the newly minted ICS intern as of yesterday. So that was his first assignment. With that understanding, Jim, it's all yours. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Hee-jae, for the very kind introduction. I believe what we agreed is that I would speak for 15 to 20 minutes about the world and the foreign policy challenges the United States faces, and then we would chat. I'm happy to do that. Let me just sort of kick things off by making three broad points. First point I'd make is that we are now in an age of great power rivalry and competition. The hopes of the 1990s and the early 2000s at the collapse of the Soviet Union and China's embrace of capitalist economics would mean the death of geopolitics have been dashed. It turned out that America's unipolar moment was just that, a moment. History hadn't in fact ended but taken a vacation, and the world wasn't flat but actually quite bumpy. Now, we can have a long argument about exactly why America's unipolar moment didn't produce what it promised. No doubt it's a mix of explanations. Perhaps it was always too optimistic about what could be achieved, especially in its assumptions that authoritarian governments would crumble in the face of globalization and digital technology. Second explanation is that U.S. missteps, most notably in Iraq and with the great financial crisis, contributed. In the first instance, because it showed the very real limits to U.S. power. In the second instance, because it raised grave questions about the U.S. economic model and the competence of the U.S. government. And third, and often overlooked, is that U.S. policy actually worked. The United States succeeded in deepening societal and economic interactions that helped other countries grow rich, but that also had a downside from the perspective of Washington because it dispersed power and multiplied vulnerabilities, paradoxically making it harder to enforce and deepen the rules of the so-called rules-based international order. So, however one apportions the blame for why we didn't achieve what the 90s promised us, we now face a world in which China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea can loosely align in an effort to reduce and blunt U.S. dominance in world politics. Whether you want to call this an axis of autocracies, an axis of upheaval, or something else, the reality remains the same, that significant major powers are willing to work against the United States and to reduce its influence in world affairs. I want to emphasize, however, that when we talk about an axis of autocracies, it is not an alliance like NATO, but rather an alignment that focuses on mutually beneficial deals, none of which are more significant than the support that China, Iran, and North Korea have given to Russia in its war on Ukraine. Second fundamental point I would make is that Donald Trump has a very different approach to foreign policy than his predecessors did. For 4 decades, he has railed against the so-called rules-based order, denouncing multilateralism as a constraint on U.S. power and blaming U.S. allies for free riding on American security and stealing American jobs through unfair trade deals. Now, Trump has a guiding belief in hard power and military power. And it's not a new belief. Indeed, you can go all the way back to Thucydides in his recounting of what the Athenians told the Melians in the so-called Melian dialogue about how the strong in the world do as they wish and the weak suffer as they must. I think essentially captures in a fundamental way what Trump is about in terms of his thinking about foreign policy. The United States is the most powerful country in the world, and it should be willing to use sharp elbows to get its way. Now, I think it's also important to recognize that as much as journalists like to talk about Donald Trump as an isolationist, he isn't in fact an isolationist. He does not limit U.S. interests to the Western Hemisphere or to North America. Witness the fact that we're currently amassing a very large military expedition in the Middle East, potentially to launch strikes against Iran. Trump does clearly believe in spheres of interest, at least for the United States. I think the recent national security strategy and the national defense strategy made that clear. No country, he has said, can be a great power if it doesn't control its own neighborhood. I think the question about Trump's view of the world, though, is whether or not he believes that other great powers are entitled to a sphere of interest as well. Now, I don't have an answer to that question. I know that many of the president's defenders argue that his philosophy is essentially a sphere of interest for me, but none for thee. Perhaps that may be the case. Events so far haven't really tested President Trump on that score. I think the big question is what would President Trump do, or what will President Trump do if China ramps up its coercion of Taiwan or even decides to invade? It's easy to see why some in Beijing might come to the conclusion, based on President Trump's talk about Taiwan, particularly how it's so far from the United States and so close to the Chinese mainland, that he may not come to the aid of Taiwan if it means war. Third point I would make for our discussion is that America's traditional friends, partners, and allies are now actively looking to hedge against the risk of what they see as a more predictable and a more predatory United States. That was the thrust of the speech that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney gave at Davos. It's the thrust of the speech that German Chancellor Friedrich Merz gave last week at Munich. And one doesn't need to have taken a graduate level course in international relations theory to see why America's friends, partners, and allies would be looking to de-risk their vulnerabilities with the United States. The problem that all these countries face, however, is that it is a lot easier to talk about de-risking than to actually do it. The United States itself has discovered how difficult that is to do in terms of its efforts to de-risk or decouple from China. This has been particularly the case when it comes to critical minerals, and China has been able to use that leverage to force President Trump to back down on his tariff threats, or many of his tariff threats. Beyond that, some countries are going to find it a lot harder to de-risk or to hedge than other countries are. I think on the economic front, if you look to Canada and Mexico, they will have the hardest time delinking themselves from the US economy for the simple reason that their economic strategy over the last 3 decades with NAFTA and then with the USMC agreement has been to deepen their integration into the US economy. Something on the order of 75% of Canadian and Mexican imports go across the border to the United States. The United States, in comparison, only about 14% of its exports go either north or south of the border. On the security front, Japan and South Korea are probably in the most difficult positions because they don't have a lot of other partners they can count on in a crisis. And Tokyo and Seoul may ultimately decide that it is better to have a unpredictable and potentially hostile security guarantor than to have none at all. I think in many ways Europe is somewhere in between. Obviously, the European Union has a very large economy. It has the capacity to push back against President Trump's tariff threats if it so chooses. Europe also has the capability to arm itself. So here I think, at least in the short term, European leaders face a significant dilemma. That is, they have committed to reaching this 5% target. I think the most significant action, of course, has been by Germany, given the size of the German economy and the traditional reluctance for debt reasons for Berlin to increase its spending on defense. The problem is that Europe's defense industrial base, I think as many people on this call know, has really sort of fallen into disrepair. It will take a while to build back up. And part of the challenge Europe faces is that President Trump views more European spending on defense as a win for the United States, not because it relieves a burden on the United States or allows the U.S. to reduce its defense spending. The president is about to submit a record request for defense spending in FY27, but because of his belief that the dollars that Europeans spend, or the euros Europeans spend on defense, are going to come to the United States to buy U.S. weaponry. Now, of course, from a European point of view, if you spend your defense dollars buying American goods, you're not going to be revitalizing your own defense industrial base, and you will be deepening your dependence on the United States, the very thing that you are trying to walk away from. But of course, Europeans are going to be hedged in by the reality that they need the United States on Ukraine, so they have to be very careful of angering the president. And at the same time, there's always going to be an incentive for individual European countries to bolt from any European-wide agreement in order to secure favor with Washington. So where does this sort of all net out? Now, I mean, I don't know that I have any real predictions to offer you. As Yogi Berra says, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. Perhaps years from now, doctoral students will be writing dissertations about how Donald Trump's art of the deal revitalized U.S. global primacy, because obviously how things unfold depend upon a lot more than the choices Washington makes. China may pursue ham-handed policies that make Trump's look pretty good in comparison. Europe may discover that it has neither the will nor the wallet to pursue strategic autonomy, no matter how much strategists urge it to. The financial and technological strengths of the United States may prove to be more resilient and more binding than a lot of experts think. Or Trump and his successors may be very successful in operating by divide and rule tactics that really take the steam out of efforts by traditional friends, partners, and allies to move away from the United States. That said, I think the likely better bet is that the United States will come to regret having turned on its friends, partners, and allies in the fashion it has, in good part because in an era of great power rivalry, there's real truth to the adage that there is strength in numbers. The United States is not, as Chancellor Merz pointed out last week at Merz, strong enough to be able to go it alone in such an environment. And I think the real risk for the United States down the road is that, not that it won't have friends or partners or allies, but they will be less committed to the United States. And I think all of this points us to a future that's likely to be more conflictual and less prosperous for all. I'll close there.
Well, thank you, Jim. ICAS is not an agent of any government or foreign principles. There's no foreign funds involved in ICAS activities. Thank you. Now, who's going to come out first? Joe Bosco. We go alphabetical.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Kim. Thank you.
Okay.
And Dr. Lindsay, it's certainly a pleasure to listen to your comprehensive overview of world affairs. I note that you did not spend a lot of time on China, and I wonder if you would agree that China is considered to be the most dangerous adversary of the United States in today's environment. And if that's the case, do you believe that Trump's policies on Ukraine, for example, are a deterrent or an opportunity for China to act more aggressively on the world scene?
Thank you, Joe.
Excellent questions, and people should feel free to call me Jim. If my children were to hear me being called doctor, they would start laughing. And my oldest would point out that he attended the University of Virginia, otherwise known as Mr. Jefferson's University, in which you are not allowed to be called a doctor unless you hold a medical degree. So I just need to do that as a disclaimer.
Thank you, Jim.
That's my questions. I mean, Joe, you're right. I mean, it's obvious that China is a major threat to U.S. interests. It is a threat to U.S. interests in a way that the Soviet Union never was. In the now 100 and roughly 30 years since the United States has been a major power on the world scene, going back to the Spanish-American War, the United States has never faced a peer competitor that has the potential to match it across all the dimensions of power. The Soviet Union could match the United States and did match the United States militarily, but never posed the same economic threat to the United States or to its allies. Obviously, China is very different. And I think, if I were to go back, I would give great credit to President Trump and his national security team in his first administration in their national security strategy by acknowledging the fact that the experiment with China had not turned out the way Americans thought it would. And I think actually it would have been the evidence that China was not pursuing a trajectory that favored Americans was obvious at least a decade earlier, maybe 15 years earlier. But for a variety of reasons, first the Bush administration and then the Obama administration was unwilling to act on what they could see happening before them. I think it was a policy that was pursued beyond its sell-by date. The challenge for the United States now is how to do it, which is my fundamental criticism of the current Trump approach, is that at just the moment where having more support is of greatest help, the president's policies are basically hollowing out that support. And I think your question about Ukraine gets to the heart of the matter, because I think it sends exactly the wrong signal. Now, I think you have to be very careful here, not to turn everything into a dichotomy, that either you're for supporting Ukraine or you're against seeing Europe stand up and carry its fair share of the burden. I do think that the president's policy toward Ukraine is not going to bring the Russians to the table. And I think, if anything, the Chinese have concluded that there is no price to pay for essentially supporting and sustaining the Russian war effort. Russia would not be able to maintain the war against Ukraine in the absence of clear economic support. I think we've moved beyond the stories of when it was the Chinese sending lots of refrigerators to Russia so that they could be scavenged for spare parts. I think the support has become deeper than that, and it is clear that Beijing sees no penalty for it. And I don't think this administration, in part because this administration is trying to do way too many things vis-a-vis China. As I understand it, the president is less worried about the security threat China poses in the region than he is worried about the economic threat. And even more than that, the size of the trade deficit. So hence we get tariffs, and of course then the tariffs will walk back, because it turns out that not only do we have leverage, they have leverage as well, and that hasn't gone terribly well. I was in Shanghai in December, and I will note I was actually there when the national security strategy came out, and I had noticed two reactions. One was surprise that this was the national security strategy of the United States, and number two, glee that this was the national security strategy of the United States.
Very good. Thank you. Follow-up question, Joe.
No, that's superb. I think we ought to give other folks a chance.
Okay, very good. General Gregson, Chip.
Thank you.
Very good.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
thank you. The concept of a rules-based global order and all has been badly damaged of late, and shows no sign of recovering anytime soon. Prime Minister Carney of Canada has offered an option to everybody else, and how do you see that playing out?
I sympathize with the Prime Minister. I do not envy the situation he finds himself in. His problem is that it is much easier to say where you need to be than to actually get there. Again, Canada's integration into the US economy is significant, and he risks creating an economic downturn for his countrymen. And here's the tension you have, and it's often the case in politics, that the public has a double wish. It wants a difficult goal. It doesn't want to have to pay a price to achieve that difficult goal. And great politicians great leaders find a way to square that circle. But there's a reason why there are few truly great leaders, because it's very hard to square a circle. Beyond the issue of sort of the disillusionment or concern that many Canadians will have if the economy starts to falter. And again, it will falter more in some sectors than in other sectors. but there's obviously potential for ripple effects. One place that Canadians are potentially vulnerable will be in cars, automobiles, big employer. But of course, if you run a restaurant next to the auto factory and the auto factory shuts down, that's not good for your business. But beyond that, what Prime Minister Carney is going to be faced with are efforts by, whether it's President Trump and the official government or people in civil society who support the president, in essence, going in and trying to undercut Prime Minister Carney's policies and position. And I will note here, just yesterday, the Premier of Alberta announced that they're going to have a referendum in the fall. Part of that referendum is going to be on this question of Alberta's relationship to the rest of Canada. Last year, on a couple of occasions, officials from the State Department met with people in Alberta who were proposing secession from Canada. Now, I should point out the secessionist movement in Canada is small, and particularly in Alberta, we're not talking about large numbers, but this clearly can become more complicated. And it is the State Department's defense was, we just meet with civil society groups. There's nothing to see here. I don't think Canadians interpret it in this quite the same way. And, obviously, if you are the Prime Minister of Canada, the question you have to ask yourself is, okay, if not the United States, then whom? One thing is to turn to Europe, and we do have a Europe-Canada free trade agreement, but the prospects of that growing are not as great because European economies currently aren't booming. The one country you can turn to would be China, but it's very clear based on the meeting that Carney had with Xi Jinping in Beijing in January, that the Chinese are going to drive a very hard bargain. And again, one of the things the United States has benefited from over the last 15 years is the ham-handed nature of Chinese diplomacy, wolf warrior diplomacy, and the rest. And again, to me, one of the most surprising things is that the Chinese haven't realized, at least situationally, that right now will be a good time to catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. That's not what they have chosen to do, either with Prime Minister Carney in his visit or with Prime Minister Starmer of the United Kingdom when he visited shortly after Prime Minister Carney did. The Chinese are still driving very hard bargains, and they're not offering up a lot of freebies.
Very good. Any follow-up question, Chip?
No, thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, General Scott Perotti. Come on.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Dr. Lindsay, thank you for your comprehensive coverage here globally. I appreciate it. The question I would have, I just came from the Munich Security Conference. Just two of the things there to get your kind of feeling on it. One is, I think it's great that the Europeans are now standing up, and they stood up to Trump, I think, as well. They're certainly spending money, but I question whether they have the resolve to go from spending money to actually delivering capacity in the time that they need to, given the threat. That's one hand. And then on the other hand, there are some that said, hey, look, Trump's temporary, which I guess my question is, how much do you think that pendulum may swing back? I think that's what they were suggesting. I'm not sure that's a good way to look at it either, but I'm interested in your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a great question, General. And I would just say, I hope that when you were in Munich, you ate well, had good German beer, enjoyed the benefits of being in Munich. Obviously, you've forgotten more about Europe than I've ever learned, so I'm sort of humble in trying to answer your question. Your first question, I think, is a good question to ask, and I think it is something always to keep in mind when you read about how Europe is going to pursue strategic autonomy, which one, I've been to many conferences in Europe, always made sure I ate well, in which Europeans have talked about strategic autonomy. And I discovered really two things. One, Europeans disagree about what strategic autonomy actually means at the end of the day. My French friends have a very distinct view of strategic autonomy and who leads that parade. I am not sure that my German and my British friends, let alone my Italian, Dutch, Polish friends, have the same vision of strategic autonomy. But the other thing reminisces, or brings back to me, because I went to Augustinian schools as a young man, what St. Augustine said about becoming chaste, which is he wanted to do it, but not quite yet. And I think that this is also sort of a problem. And one of the reasons why it's something that is sort of, always in the future, gets back to your second question, which is, well, things are going to change and we don't need to do it. And let's face it, in democracies, not just European democracies, in democracies, political systems have a bad habit of not confronting tough issues until they absolutely, positively must address those issues. And I think the challenge you have right now in Europe is the invasion of Ukraine has galvanized them. Trump's behavior has galvanized them, but there are two stumbling points, one logistical and one political. The logistical issue, as you point out, is that I call it the restaurant problem. It's easy to say to friends, hey, you want to go out to eat Friday night? Everybody says yes. But then finding a restaurant where you can all dine requires a negotiation to fit in the United Nations. Some people want Korean, others want Japanese. Others say, heck no, I want Italian. No, I have barbecue because I had Italian last week. So you have this sort of issue of how do you pool resources? Because obviously, as you know, the most efficient thing is to have lots of duplication across the European Union. The notion that Europe can stand on its 2 feet is predicated on the idea that Europe is going to spend money and invest and build capacity in a rational fashion. That falls apart if you have 27 navies and 27 armies and 27 intelligence services and what have you. But the other weak link here is the political weak link, and that is there's another truism about democracy. When faced with big problems, democracies sometimes can convince themselves that a problem isn't really a problem, or that the problem is a function of what they're doing. To me, the favorite one in American history is the 1930s, where it was clear to any sentient being that the risk of war was rising in Europe and in Asia, that the United States had interests there that were going to be affected. And the reaction of the American political system was essentially to try to find some way to make the problem go away, to believe that there was a recipe that would save them from having to do tough things. What I worry about in Europe today, particularly in Germany, is that you have political parties that will define the problem away by arguing that we can reach an accommodation with the Russians, that the reason we're having these problems is because we followed the United States. I think you see that particularly with the Alternative for Germany party, which sort of peddles this romantic notion of what Germany and Russia can accomplish together. So that's the other thing that I worry about. I will note in Germany, we have some upcoming state elections where my friends who follow German politics worry greatly that the Alternative for Germany is going to do very, very well, and that's going to shake up politics in Berlin and make Chancellor Merz's job all the tougher. And again, you get back to the EU is not an it, it's a they. And it really depends to some extent on what the most powerful countries in the union can do and how far they can push. But if the people across the table from them think you're not going to be here in 6 months, then maybe I don't have to give you anything. Because again, this is the classic problem of how do you divide up the pie, which has always been challenging in democracies.
Thank you, Jim. Skip, do you have a follow-up question?
No, not right yet. Thank you. Excellent. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Very good. Hey, Sick Hacker. Sick.
Can you hear me?
Sure. Sound beautiful.
Loud and clear.
I know you can't see me because I can't get my camera to work. It's camera turned off, but
Okay.
it should have worked. Anyway, so
go
let me
ahead.
ask the question. Jim, thank you very much. Very comprehensive picture of what's going on. I'm taken by your last comment, that democracies as such don't want to address the tough issues until they absolutely have to. So to me, one of the poster childs for tough issues is North Korea. And so I just wonder, and as you know, North Korea is building up its capabilities really alarmingly. What is North Korea going to have to do before we're finally going to try to address that issue? That's the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Sick.
Well, Sig, I actually feel like I should ask you that question since you are the go-to person on this topic.
Yeah.
I don't see any movement right now in Washington, in the Trump administration, to tackle the North Korea issue. As best I can tell, there's just a hope that they won't have to deal with it right now. And I would have to say, if I were the Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor, excuse me, they're the same person, but Secretary of Defense, go across the cabinet, they already have a lot of other things on their plate. And as you know, another rule of life in Washington is that crises grab attention. Slow-growing problems are easy to ignore. Now, the wild card in all of this, Sig, obviously, is the President of the United States. Because, when he gives his State of the Union address on Tuesday night, for all I know, he's going to announce a major deal with North Korea, or he's going to announce has a major offer to North Korea. I mean, it's quite possible that the president will try things. Now, one of the interesting questions, and I don't have an answer for it, maybe you do, is why hasn't President Trump made North Korea a priority in his first 13 months in office, given that he took great pride in his outreach during his first term? And I don't know why, because there was certainly a lot of speculation in 2024 that President Trump was going to resume his conversations with the leader of North Korea, but that really hasn't seemed to happen. And indeed, I would say, generally speaking, one of the surprising things about the Trump second term is how little overt attention is being paid to Asia.
Well, thank you. Sick.
Outside
Go
of the
ahead.
trade realm. Outside of the trade realm.
Yeah. So, Jim, let me just come back. What concerns me, you're right. I mean, Trump hasn't made the move, although there were a couple of signs where it looked like he may make a move, but he didn't.
Yep.
What I find interesting, my colleague Bob Carlin and I, is we watched this, certainly back from the days that we went to see General Scaparrotti, many years ago, is, of course, he's not only built up Kim Jong-un, he's not only built up his overall military capabilities, especially the nuclear capabilities, but if you look at everything else as to what he's put together, I mean, it just, Bob Carroll, I really do believe, I mean, he's making preparations to do something. And I personally think that we in this country right now feel too comfortable with the fact that we can deter, the good Mr. Kim. And I think he may be smarter, or at least think differently than that. That there are things that he could do in South Korea that will make sure that the U.S. will not come into play. And so he may actually think he has a lot more leeway of what to do in South Korea than we tend to believe with our comment of ironclad relationship and ironclad deterrent. And I'm just afraid that we're not paying enough attention to that. So that's my concern.
Thank you, Skip. You want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in with
Yeah.
Sig. I think I agree with him, and I think that there's two other things that have developed. One, this relationship with Russia, with no real understanding of what kind of technological advances that they're providing or help they're providing to Kim Jong-un, and they're certainly not doing what they're doing for North Korea is not helping Russia for nothing. And then China, who now is much less reluctant to step in and temper some of North Korea's actions. And I think those two things too make this more dangerous than it was in the past when I was in command there.
Very good. Skip.
If I just may
Yeah,
just jump in
go
there,
ahead.
what
All
I
right,
want to say is that I agree with what both Sig and General Scaparrotti said. There's one thing in what Sig said that I think is putting a pin in or underlying or highlighting, which is that leaders don't necessarily calculate the way we think they should calculate. I mean, one of the great perils of my business of being in Washington is that people project on other countries how they should assess their interests, how they should assess their options, how they should assess the risks and costs. And I think history has shown us time and time again that leaders of other countries often calculate their interests, their options, and their risks differently than we do. And that can lead to some very bad outcomes. And again, I would just say the poster child most recently for this was President Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Because if you had polled people here in Washington, D.C. In January of 2024, you would have been hard pressed to find anyone who thought that the Russians would launch a full-scale invasion. All the betting money was, like fight off a part of the Donbass, because everything else just seemed like a lousy idea that no sane president, even one that was risk-prone, would take. And then, of course, we have Russian special forces landing at the Kyiv airport. So I just think what Sig says is very important. I don't know, however, how to solve for that problem.
Very good. Skip, do you want to jump in? General Gregson?
No, thank you. Not now.
Okay, very good. So Bosco, you have follow-on?
No, I didn't want to intervene on this particular point, but I did have a question for Jim later, if we can come back to it.
Okay, very good. Stick, do you have any follow-on question?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, that's
Okay.
That's precisely the sort of conversation that I wanted to have, and
Okay.
I'm glad to
Very
see
good.
that Jim and General Scaparrotti are also as much concerned as I am. So thank you.
Very good. Hija, do you have a question?
Yes, Dr. Kim. Thank
Yeah.
you very much. Thank you, Dr. Lindsay, for your time and for sharing your
You can
insights.
call me Jim too. Don't worry about it.
Jim.
I won't.
Yes, I'll try. My name is Hee-jae Jung. I'm a new ICAS intern and an undergraduate student at Azusa Pacific University, double majoring in honors humanities and international relations with a minor in economics. According to the 2025 National Security Strategy, the Trump administration prioritizes protecting the Western Hemisphere and preventing the emergence of regional hegemons Given limited resources, this appears to reflect a reordering of strategic priorities. How do you think this strategic prioritization will affect U.S. commitments and security dynamics in the Indo-Pacific? Thank you.
Very good, Hije.
Wow, PJ, terrific question, big question. There are people on this call much better positioned than me to give you an answer. And also, we'll probably talk about this for days. Let me make 3 quick responses. Number one, I think we have to avoid exaggerating how much of a shift in resources is going to the Western Hemisphere on a sustained basis. Okay, so I think we certainly right now, or late last year into beginning of this year, saw a surge of forces into the region to carry out the rendition of Nicolas Maduro. But I will note that many of those forces have been redistributed going forward, and apparently are now amassing in the Middle East. And one of the reasons the negotiations with Iran have dragged on is precisely because you had to wait for resources to redeploy. And I will note that the president is going to make a request for a record-setting defense budget. So the United States, if Congress goes along, will be spending more resources, sort of easing some of the constraints. Obviously, it takes time to build weapons, and the Defense Department has a massive problem with its procurement process, which I won't dive into. Second thing I will note is even at the end of the day, if you have flexibility in moving things and you spend more, you're still going to have a constraint, which is why you have to, in fact, prioritize. And here's where I get to the third point. It's not clear at the end of the day what the national defense strategy actually means. And I say that because these documents are written essentially by a committee. Even if at the end of the day they give it to some wordsmith and say, give this coherence and make sure it appeals to all of the president's hot buttons. But at the end of the day, it is a bunch of things stapled together, which is why when I read it, I go through and I can say, rather than, I didn't read it and say, gee whiz, everybody's coming to the Western Hemisphere. What I read it was, there are an awful lot of things in here that people in the Department of Defense can point to defend continuing to do what they are already doing. And, you know, okay, they did not mention National Defense, or doesn't mention Taiwan, but we have the first island chain, gets referenced a couple of times. In the National Security Strategy, there were references to a free and open Indo-Pacific. I forget the exact language. But again, from a bureaucratic point of view, whether you're in the State Department or you're in the intelligence community or in the Defense Department, there are things you can point to that says, we're going to keep doing this because the president wants us to do it. So I think we have to avoid overreacting to what is the change, I think has some meaning. Witness Venezuela. But I wouldn't say that somehow we've hit a button and gone back in the time machine and it's the William McKinley administration, 1902.
Hide, do you have a follow-up question?
I wanted to ask a slightly different question, but it seems General Gregson has a comment. So yeah.
Thank you. Chip, go ahead.
I think the best we can say about the national security strategy and the national defense strategy is that it's a good thing we've never paid much attention to these documents in the past, unlike other countries who craft these documents to gain consensus across the government and then across their population. These 2 documents show every sign of being cobbled together at the last minute and thrown over to Congress who required them.
Thank you, Chip. General Scaparotti, go ahead.
I did. Okay.
Very good.
I'll learn this one of these days. Jim, along the same thread, I mean, I admit right up front that some administrations pay more attention to these documents than others. Most of them just publish it and it goes out and it's referred to time to time. I think that's true. But over different administrations' work, there is a thread of foreign policy that's been fairly consistent. And I mean, and at least I think this one's got a fairly significant shift in the way we go about that policy. Would you agree or disagree with that, or that's inherent within these documents, or do you have another perspective on it?
Well, I mean, I would put the documents aside. I think Donald Trump has a fundamentally different approach to foreign policy than his predecessors did. I mean, if I'll use a football metaphor. I mean, if I were to look at Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, you know, you're on a football field. Some of them are at the 20 and 30. Some of them are at midfield. Some of them are at on the other 20 or 30, but they're all in a football stadium. Donald Trump is outside in the parking lot. I mean, it's just a different approach to it because it, again, proceeds from a fundamental belief that the real threat to America is not from its enemies, but from its friends. And that's what fundamentally distinguishes it from, let's say, the foreign policy of George W. Bush, which was also quite critical of allies. But at the end of the day, believed that we would do this, our allies would rally behind us, and it had a fundamental sense that there were limits on where the United States could go, and George W. Bush wasn't looking to extract more rent, as economists would say, from American allies and partners. President Trump's just in a very different space again, and he has been completely transparent to the American public since at least September of 1987, when he paid for ads in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post, full page, where he laid out his manifesto about American foreign policy in the idiocy of believing in friends, partners, and allies, because all they're doing is picking your pocket. You could read that advertisement today, change the names of a few countries, and it would perfectly fit this administration. He has been very, very consistent. What's interesting is the shift between Trump 1 and Trump 2, which isn't because the president changed his views. It has much more to do with the fact that, one, he's now quite comfortable being president. Back in when he won in 2016, he didn't expect to win, and he hadn't prepared to win. And that leads to the second thing. When he staffed his first term administration, he staffed it with people he was told he should pick, or that he thought looked like they belonged in the job. So you get Rex Tillerson because he looks like a Secretary of State. You get General Mattis because he has a cool nickname that the president really, really likes. But it became clear very quickly that General Mattis, Secretary Mattis, John Kelly, Gary Cohn, Rex Tillerson didn't see the world the way President Trump did. So in Trump's second term, what he's done is surrounding himself with people who either share his worldview or are not going to get in the way of his worldview. And that's why things have been so different.
Very good. Thank you. Stick Hacker, go ahead.
Thank you. Jim, we shouldn't let you off the hook here without asking a question about Iran. So, you know, as you well know, Iran as such has been looking at nuclear weapons for over 50 years. So to make sure the option is there from the Shah and then the Ayatollahs, you know, for the last 30 years. President Trump has taken a rather interesting approach. And so I would just like to get your sense as to what do you see as really driving him and where might this lead? Thank you.
Very good.
It's a great question, Sig, and I'm reminded of what the columnist H.L. Mencken of the Baltimore Sun said many years ago that every problem has an easy solution that is always wrong. And I think that Iran in particular attests to the limits of President Trump's worldview. Again, President Trump's worldview is based on the notion the strong do as they will and the weaker submit. And what he is confronting in Iran, I think to his surprise, is that despite the exercise of American military power, despite the attack last summer, despite the threat of additional attacks right now, the Iranians are not agreeing to a deal. Now, again, we're getting down to the end, and as they say, it's only at the last moment that you discover who you're dealing with and what you're dealing with. It's quite possible that the Iranians will say no, 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 up until the last moment when they cry uncle. Or it's possible they'll just continue to say no. That's the nature of coercive bargaining. But I think the president is discovering that there are some red lines that countries won't cross, or they won't cross unless you force them to cross it. And here I will sort of note, and this is to me the interesting thing about the president's policy in Nicaragua, and the talk of a Dawn Road doctrine. It's not really a Dawn Road doctrine. It is resuscitating the Theodore Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Back in the early 1900s, Theodore Roosevelt had a problem. Problem was countries in Latin America were badly run. They borrow a lot of money from foreign banks, and then the German Navy would show up or the British Navy would show up demanding payment. This violated the Monroe Doctrine. So, in essence, what Europeans said to Roosevelt was, if you don't want us there, you're going to solve this problem. So we turned the Monroe Doctrine on its head from keeping Europeans out of Latin America to taking the right for the United States to instill order and good behavior in Latin America. And what Trump essentially is doing is, again, repeating that. And it's really interesting when he went into Venezuela, the expectation of most Venezuelan Americans, most Cuban Americans I know, was that he was going to unseat the regime and we were going to get President Machado. And what was sort of remarkable about it is that the president, it's very clear now, has no interest in regime change. He's only interested in leadership change with regime management. And I think the real interesting question in terms of Venezuela is how long can the president sustain that policy? Because with time, he's going to come under growing pressure to do more to reinstate Venezuela's democracy. And that takes him deeper into Venezuelan politics. And if we go in that direction, we're going to discover that the existing regime also has a red line because they don't want to give up power. They can live with what they have to right now because they don't have any viable option. But when your option is fight or die, most people fight. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing to keep an eye on. And you go back to history, because I love history. What was really interesting about the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is that it worked out actually okay for Theodore Roosevelt. But when William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson attempted it, they discovered that it blew up in their face. And it was a problem that beleaguered American presidents from Taft all the way through Herbert Hoover, believe it or not, given the interventions in Nicaragua and the Dominican Republic and also in Haiti. So again, the reality is, and life often teaches us, the fact things start off well doesn't mean they won't end badly.
Very good, Jim. Chung-Soo, go ahead.
Thank you. Do you think that the United States will attack Iran after President Trump gives the address at the Congress next Tuesday? And is it true that I saw it on the headline that the British will not allow United States to use their airbase in the case of attacking Iran?
That is what the news has in fact reported. And my understanding is that London is now under intense pressure to reconsider. It is also under growing pressure domestically not to buckle in or buckle under to the president, which is, again, for all these leaders, the more foreign policy becomes something that engages their domestic publics, they have even more constraints than they previously had. I mean, I think the thing is, I don't know when or if the United States will attack Iran. I don't know how long such an attack might last. I don't know even what the purpose of the attack might be. One thing I do know is I wouldn't assume that the attack won't happen until after the State of the Union address or within the deadline that the president has given. He said yesterday, Iran, we're going to know in 10 days what he decides to do. And then he was asked again, he said, well, 10 to 15 days. But I will note that last year, he issued a statement saying that Iran had 2 weeks and the United States attacked Iran less than 30 hours later. Now, you would think that the president of the United States wouldn't launch an attack on another country just before he gives a State of the Union address. But I also wouldn't have thought that the United States Supreme Court would issue a ruling rebuking the president on his lead economic and foreign policy tactic, namely tariffs, just 3 days before they have to go and sit on the floor of the House in front of the president as he gives that address. So again, getting back to the conversation with Sig, sometimes people calculate their interests and options differently than we on the outside would calculate them. My big question, I have 2 questions. One, of course, is what is the point of this? Because many Iranian Americans, many people in the Middle East, hope that this is about unseating the regime. And I think that gets back to the brutal way in which the regime cracked down on opponents last month, and also comments the president has made about how he was going to do something, when I think cooler heads might have cautioned the president not to raise expectations because changing that regime is going to be very, very difficult. But the other question really is going to be how long this operation, if it does take place, is going to go for. Because the president, if there's a trend in his use of military force, is the president likes situations in which several things are true. 1, it's against an outmatched opponent. 2, it's going to be over quickly. 3, the probability of success, or maybe to rephrase it, the probability you can claim a success is very, very high. So, the president likes walkovers. And quite honestly, who doesn't like matchups in which you're pretty much guaranteed to win? I think and so what that means is the president may scale back his ambitions and the size of a strike. I don't know. It's simply a possibility. I do think, based on conversation with people in the region, what they're concerned about is that he's going to inadvertently kick off a wider conflict. Now, again, if you're in Tehran, you have every incentive to get as many people as possible worried that there's a wider war, because that's one way you have to try to deter the president of the United States. And again, it's much easier to talk about why things happened after the fact than to tell you what's going to happen before the fact.
Very good. General Scap, do you have comments to make?
No, thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Very
Okay.
sound.
General Gregson.
Carrying on about the Iran thing, back a million years ago, was involved in doing a number of war games on it, and this is not an easy nut to crack here. I think General Scaparrotti will probably agree.
I was in CENTCOM 3. I agree.
I worry that we think we're going to dash in there with another midnight hammer thing and then declare victory, and I don't think that's possible in this situation.
Well,
Very
I
good,
would just
thank you.
I would just note on that score is that with President Trump, it is always possible to do that because President Trump likes to grade his own homework, and he's a very generous grader. So
Okay.
again, since we don't know what he wanted, we don't have any idea of whether he's going to be scaling back his ambitions. And if the New York Times reports next week that he did, he's going to go out and accuse it of fake news and deny that any of it happened. So that's sort of the challenge in evaluating all of this.
Thank you, Jim. Sig Hacker, do you have something to pour
Thank you.
into?
Very, very affirmative. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you. Chung-Su, go ahead.
One possibility, you did ask what is the point of attacking Iran, and you don't see any point. And one possible answer might be that because Trump is held in hostage by Netanyahu.
Well, I didn't say I didn't see any point in attacking Iran. What I would say is I can see multiple points or multiple reasons to attack Iran. I mean, one reason would be that you want to disable or complete the job that Operation Midnight Hammer didn't do. And again, here's sort of the disjuncture between what the president claimed. We obliterated it, it's done, we don't have to do it again, it's all over. And where we seem to be today. You may have broader ambitions of not only taking out remaining nuclear facilities, but also damaging ballistic missile facilities or production facilities like that, all the way up to regime change. And I just don't know where the president's thinking is on this. And again, it may be that the president himself has never really decided what it is that he wants to do. If that's the case, he would not be the first world leader who did not decide ahead of time what he was trying to do before military force was used. There's lots of historical examples. World War I perhaps rises to the top of that list. But I think your question does get to the issue of, what are the countries that are urging the president to act? And clearly, the Israeli government, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, has been pushing President Trump to do this because, from an Israeli security point of view, Iran and Iran's ability to get a nuclear weapon is an existential threat. And the United States military is simply better funded, better equipped to carry out these kind of missions than the IDF is. So you can certainly understand the Iranian position, but I wouldn't, the Israeli position, I wouldn't go from that and say that President Trump is doing this because Prime Minister Netanyahu wants him to do. I mean, I take at face value that President Trump is deeply concerned about the spread of nuclear weapons. I mean, he has simply come back to the issue too many times over the course of his political career, even before his political career began, talking about his great concern about nuclear weapons. So I don't think the president's thinking is sort of a secondary result of the ambitions of others. I mean, I think you can criticize the tactics the president's pursuing to get his end. I mean, I, for example, am deeply skeptical of Golden Dome and what it would produce, and I could think of lots of other ways to defense dollars that, in my view, would have a bigger payoff. But again, I don't think we should just think of the president as a cork getting moved along by the current of history or the imprecations of other heads of state.
Very good. General Scaparrotti, go ahead, please.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, you mentioned, that our military is large, it's excellent, deep pockets, etc. What are your thoughts about the advancement of our military and the reduction of our foreign service and State Department and the impacts that may have as we look out to the future? This administration has taken a very different approach.
Yeah, I'm actually worried about the military and about our diplomacy or our diplomats. I have had the pleasure, honor to have met with, worked with, talked to, listened to, watched many mid-career senior military officials. You are a very impressive bunch of people. Your services demand an awful lot of you. I should thank you for your service. And I worry that we're seeing some of the things that make the professionalism of the U.S. military so outstanding begin to break down. And I worry about the politicization of the military over the long term, not necessarily because senior military officials themselves become political, though we can argue that some have, or maybe have not, but that people begin to see military leaders not as nonpartisan individuals providing professional military advice, but the generals from one party or another. When I taught at the University of Iowa a long time ago, students would always ask me who was my favorite figure in American foreign policy. And I was always telling them it was George C. Marshall. And I thought he was the most impressive and most underrated. And I always like to tell them, Marshall's response when he was asked the question, who he voted for. And he would say, my mother was a Democrat, my father is a Republican, I'm an Episcopalian. And I always thought that sort of nicely captured a desire not to be sort of caught up into the political maelstrom. And so, but I do worry that we're moving in that direction. And I'm deeply worried about the status of foreign service support. Now, I have to put my cards on the table along with my frequent co-author, Ambassador Ivo Dalder. I've written pieces about how to restructure the State Department over the years and how broken the State Department is over the years. I never had to suffer for that. He did because he became an ambassador. But having said that, I have great respect for foreign service officers. And I think as all the people on this call know, it is very difficult to build a high functioning institution. It is very easy to break it. And once you break it, once you lose institutional memory, you discover, just how hard it is to get back to where you once were. And I think one of the challenges that the country faces is really this issue of state capacity, as political scientists like to call it, that this administration is really reducing state capacity, because it's not just in the foreign service or in the military. You can see it across the board, obviously in the health sector, but a variety of other places. And it's very hard to get talented people to come into government if they're worried that they're going to basically end up in a situation in which the capricious desires of a president or a change of administrations can all of a sudden get them in trouble for doing their job.
Very good. Thank you, Jim. Now, time is up. Any person like to make a last call?
Yes, can you hear me, Sangju?
Oh, Larry, welcome. Finally, you came. Go ahead, Larry. All right.
Yes, a question for Mr. Lindsay. Going back to North Korea with regard to what I think is a more possible early on scenario involving North Korea. the papers have told us that the tripartite U.S., Ukraine, Russian talks have collapsed. I was reading that this morning. That means the war is going to likely continue full scale in 2026. And I think Vladimir Putin wants to break Ukraine resistance this year because he knows Russia has deep economic problems that could get worse if this war just goes in to 2027 or 2028. Now, one of the things he has demanded in the talks is that Ukraine cede to Russia the Donetsk region of eastern Ukraine. The Russians control about 70% of it, but the Ukrainians in the 30% they control have established strong defense lines that the Russians have not been able to penetrate. The scenario involving North Korea that I think is very possible is that Putin may call on Kim Jong-un, like he did with the Kursk region, to commit the 20 to 30,000 North Korean troops that I think are reportedly still in Russia into Ukraine itself to spearhead an offensive in the Donetsk region. If we see Putin calling for a second time now on the North Koreans to intervene to achieve what his own army has not been able to achieve, what do you think? And we see North Korean troops in Ukraine fighting the Ukrainians in Donetsk later this year. What do you think should be the response of the U.S. and its NATO allies to that situation of the first really direct foreign military intervention in this war?
Thank you, Larry.
Larry, you have just asked the kind of question that keeps people in the White House, and I assume the Department of Defense, up at night, because it puts a lot of conflicting interests and risks at play. I mean, to me, the most immediate response would be for the United States to return to a more forward-leaning posture in terms of arming the Ukrainians. I can't speak to the question of how much of a difference the introduction of Korean troops into Ukraine would make to the fighting on the battlefield. But I certainly think it would be a mistake to act on the assumption that they wouldn't make a difference. And I can certainly understand why the Ukrainians do not wish to give away land that they haven't lost, particularly given that they have a reasonable fear that, one, any ceasefire is simply a time for Russia to pause, regroup, and rearm. And because if you are in Kyiv, you have to have very serious doubts about any security guarantee provided by any outside power. You're simply taking a really big bet on friendship. What do you do about North Korea? I don't know that you have a big tool set to work from. North Korea already is heavily sanctioned. I suppose there are things you can do there on the front, particularly with various North Korean cybercrime things, but you're sort of there yet. And then you have to ask the following. If we find some way to squeeze North Korea, what are their options and what are they likely to do? Now, I'm not a military person. I don't know the status of North Korea's military. I do worry. I think, as General Scaparrotti pointed out, that the North Koreans have not provided ammunition and men to Russia out of fraternal solidarity as a reward for the founding of North Korea 80 plus years ago. I think they're doing it because they're getting something for it. What fear is that they are getting more than we realize, and that they are better able to make use of what they get than we realize. But this takes you into issues that are just well beyond my knowledge base, and I can't tell you what it is. But I think you are laying out. Put it this way: if I were going to write a Robert Ludlum espionage novel for coming out in 2027, or do a Netflix special show that I'm current. I mean, this is what you just laid out as the grounds for a great Netflix series, because it raises a lot of really difficult questions, and the answers people give depend upon what they think about a number of questions that are very hard to nail down.
Very good. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Larry. Ladies and gentlemen, time is up. We'll let Jim go away. And let's give him a big round of applause. Thank you.
You're very
Thank
kind.
you, Jim.
I'm going to applaud all of you back.
You did a great job. We'll get
You're
back to
very
you,
nice,
Jim.
even though most of you know more about these topics than I do. So,
Not at all. We'll get back to you, Jim.
okay.
Take care.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay, right. Thank you, General Scaparrotti. Thank you, General Gregson. Thank you, Larry and Joe Bosco. And who else? Bob Hershey. Now I see you. Okay, very good. Okay, thank you, Hijay. We'll get back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim.
Time is up. Meeting is adjourned. Oh, Sungjae. Okay, Jebum. That's a great session. Thank you, Jung Soo. It was a great session. Yeah, thank you.